Diplomacy is like jazz, endless variations on a theme. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the dangers of Sri Lanka becoming someone else's hub. To talk about all this and more, we've invited 5 guests to our studios this evening as well. Joining us this evening on the show are Dr. Laksri Mendis, former Executive Director, Lakshman Kadirgam Institute; Dr. George Cook, diplomatic historian and strategist; Dr. Pavitra Jayawardena, senior lecturer, University of Colombo; Kusum Mujatilaka, foreign policy analyst, as well as Dr. Harinda Vidanage, head of department, strategic studies, Kotalavala Defence University. To pose questions from our panelists, onto my immediate right is Shanaya Darigam, onto my immediate left is Jayamal Ratnayaka. And you too can join in the conversation. You can drop in your messages on 076 656 5353. The number once again, 076 656 5353. Let's get the ball rolling today with Dr. Laksri Mendis, former Executive Director of the Lakshman Kadirgam Institute. What are your thoughts on the subject that we are talking today?
Yeah, I think, thank you for inviting me after many moves. I've not been here for a very, very long time. My thoughts, I don't think diplomacy is like jazz. It's an art and a science. Because art is that you have to know exactly what to do in a situation. The science means you must study it very carefully before you speak 2 words in regard to any subject. And you must have interdisciplinary knowledge to be an ambassador, because you can be asked to speak on Greek mythology or even Hindu mythology at a function, and you are ready to take the challenge. So it is the most challenging job if you are going to mingle with the society. To some extent you should get acculturated to that society and also enjoy their music and also impart your music to them, or play golf. There you get contacts and pianist, or you walk. These are the attributes of a successful business or diplomat. And I have been able to get a lot of funds through the society, not through the governments at the time of the tsunami, because I moved with the people and we had interaction. So I think it is a very good job. You have to measure up to those standards if you are going to deliver goods for your own country. So my first point is the foreign policy is difficult to define, our foreign policy. Some say we were non-aligned at some time. Now we are not non-aligned, now neutral. And we have, but nonetheless, we have a close relations with India, which is undeniable. So, and we know that India is our neighbor, but we are all somewhat of Indian origin, and it's very difficult to extricate ourselves from that paradigm. So we need to work very well, closely with India if we are to achieve any security as well as other issues relating to small island states. We have a good diplomatic staff in 50 or 60, about 60 postings, and accreditation to another many hundred countries. So we have, compared to many small states across the world, we have representation. We spent a lot of money on this, our diplomacy, our state. So 1 or 2 points I wish to, at the outset, tell you, diplomacy is not simply our foreign policy. Diplomats will have to be representing at multilateral postings, will have to have a good knowledge of the issues that come under multilateral institutions like the human rights, or at various institutions across the world. Then also diplomacy involves economic diplomacy today. How to get investors into Sri Lanka. That is a must for Sri Lanka. So in dealing with those economic diplomacy, we have the port city. I don't think it has been properly managed to sell the product to the international company. The brochures are not given to any embassy. Where I remember when I was in the Bahamas, Pindling punished the gentleman who was in the foreign service for not carrying the brochures for a conference, which has nothing to do with the investment, but he said you must carry for every time you leave the country the brochures and give it to them if you want to sell the product in our country. So it is a vast topic which cannot be described in 2-3 minutes. So I think I have done some
justice. Thank you very much.
To this end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dayananda Laksari Mendis, former Executive Director of the Lakshman Kadrigam Institute. Dr. Mendis, I didn't say that diplomacy is jazz. It was Richard Holbrooke, the former US ambassador to the United Nations, who said this.
Yes.
And when you speak about the fact that at least a brochure has to be there to facilitate economic diplomacy,
yes,
that is where the diplomats in Sri Lanka currently have failed to do so.
Yes.
And it seems like jazz, unfortunately, at this very moment of time.
Yeah.
I now move my attention to Dr. George Cook, a diplomatic historian and strategist.
Thank you once again for the invitation, Shamir. When we look at where we stand right now, we're at the 75th anniversary of our independence, but also at a very crucial juncture. We have gone through one of our worst crises in our history, probably in the entirety of the country, going back not just to the period of independence, but even before that. And when we talk about where we are right now and what we are doing to get out of the situation, how we are using foreign policy, what are we putting into the foreign policy mechanism, how are we trying to extricate ourselves out of this crisis by using foreign policy, using our diplomatic connectivity, engagement. Dr. Mendis also referred to non-alignment, the non-aligned movement. Is it completely out of our system? Is it something we don't rely on anymore? It's something we can probably come back to later on. But have we understood where we are as a country and what we need to achieve? Do we know what our targets are? Do we know what we want to achieve on an annual basis? It's great to look to the future and talk about setting targets, which other countries are doing and they're achieving on a constant basis. But do we know where we want to be at the end of this year? Is it just a case of not sinking, but just staying afloat? Is that all that we're aiming for? What are we looking at in the long term? What are we looking at for the next couple of years? What are we looking at post-IMF? We've gotten the money, we're getting the money. Have we thought about what we're going to do after that? Have we thought about what we're going to do with our engagement in multilateral fora? Have we thought about how we are going to deal with specific issues that we still have internationally? It might be at a multilateral fora, it might be a bilateral issue within a country, and we can talk about some of those. How are we responding to it? How are we strategizing and getting the best out of the network that we have? Sri Lanka is not a non-entity on the world stage. We are a country that has engaged continuously for decades since independence, and we have a position. The strength of it may be debatable at times, but we certainly have a key position out there, and how much do we use to leverage on that position? This is where we have to ask ourselves at this particular juncture going forward, what is it that we want to achieve through our foreign policy, through our diplomatic network and our missions out there?
George, because we have a couple of seconds before we wrap up your time limit as far as the first round is concerned, you were also part of the foreign service in Sri Lanka for some time. Tell us, why did you quit?
I was in the foreign service from 2007 to 2017.
10 years is a long time.
It was a decade, yes. And I've served outside the country and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombo too. But it came to a point where I was reading for my PhD, and various attempts were being made to block it in order to ensure that that didn't happen. Where I had a former foreign secretary telling me that he had a BSc in mathematics and he was the secretary, and he questioned the need for a PhD in the foreign service. And that's the point at which I realized our goals for this country are very different, where we should be taking the country. Other countries are looking at specialization. The role of the diplomat has changed drastically on the world stage. We talk about being a generalist. We talk about needing to know a little bit of everything. But we're coming into an era in which leaders don't need diplomats anymore. Is the diplomat becoming obsolete now? Is the diplomat going to evolve? This is where the revolution requires specialization. And maybe at that time Sri Lanka didn't want that. Or those in positions, in certain bureaucratic positions, I must add, not political, bureaucratic positions did not want that. And attempts were made to block it. That's where I thought it's better to pursue other paths, and you can do so much more outside the service for this country than within the service.
But if you did continue in the foreign service, I presume your status today would be deputy ambassador? Maybe.
Me, the big question mark.
Big question mark. It all depends on how much you hold a candle to the politicians, unfortunately, as far as the Sri Lankan diplomatic service is concerned. But we leave that for another time to discuss. I now move my attention towards Dr. Pavitra Jayawardena, Senior Lecturer, University of Colombo.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. So in my opening remarks, I would suggest that when we to look at Sri Lankan foreign policy, I would suggest let's look at Sri Lanka not just as a geographical unit. The mainstream foreign policy analysis has always been trapped in territoriality, understanding a country just as a nation state that has rigid geographical boundaries. But I would suggest that we shall look at the country as a living organ which has multiple frontiers. We have a large community of migrants who operate across boundaries in a very transcendent way, and we have different types of identities that we have earned throughout the past decades. We have come out from certain experiences, historical experiences, colonized experiences. We have had many struggles within the country that has international implications. So I would rather look at the way that we have to look back at Sri Lankan foreign policy, that maybe we shall not trap in that territorial explanation for the country. Now, why I would think that this is a good moment to revisit Sri Lankan foreign policy is for obvious reasons, that we are in this economic crisis, we are after a massive people's uprising. We have certainly understood that what we have been doing during the last couple of decades have failed. And certain policies that we have made as a country, as a state, as political institutions have failed. So I think it's right time to revisit those policies in a very critical way and be humble to accept where we have gone wrong, rather than trying to put just plasters and somehow trying to move on. And in doing so, I would suggest that we as Sri Lankan academics and policymakers, people should think of Sri Lankan foreign policy in a very holistic manner. Obviously in terms of defense, security, trade and all that, but also in a much more holistic way to also see, I would actually recommend in my first round, I would suggest that we should really very seriously think of Sri Lankan migrant community as a very potential foreign policy or diplomatic agents who operate across the world, and to try to connect with them, make policies to outreach them, and to think how they would help us in expanding our domestic interests. Because going ahead with the very popular understanding of foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics. So I would agree with what Dr. George said. First step would be to be clear about what our domestic interests are, because if it's not clear, we might not be able to expand it. But if we are at that stage, then to also look at Sri Lankan migrants as a potential group of agents to connect with and get their support to expand our interests.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pavitra Jayawardena, Senior Lecturer, University of Colombo. I want to ask you where we have gone wrong, but I'm just going to leave that for the second round. When we come back with the Q&A, I'll pose this question to you, Dr. Pavitra, as we go along. I now move attention to Kusum Vijaytilaka, Foreign Policy Analyst.
First of all, yes, thank you, Shamir, and thank you, the Face the Nation team, for having me here. It's a great panel to be a part of. And also thank you for the sufficiently broad title that you've given us. I think it lets us talk about foreign policy from all sorts of angles. It's already happened a few times on the panel. And I think that's important because foreign policy is such a broad, as my colleagues have already said, it's such a broad topic that it really requires, someone mentioned the word multidisciplinary or intersectional sort of analysis of it. Your title suggests a question about sovereignty, I think, essentially, and the freedom to make decisions. We are having this conversation in a specific moment in history as well, because there's a lot of realignments happening globally, not least the Ukraine-Russian conflict, not least the American-Chinese emerging conflict, Cold War 2.0, and everything else that's aligned to that. We've already mentioned non-alignment. So how has non-alignment served Sri Lankan interests over the last multiple number of decades? What happened to non-alignment during the previous administration? And if someone can tell me what the current status is, I mean, we've got some great people on the panel to tell us about that. It's also the intersectionality is also critical, because if you try to consider foreign policy in isolation, you're likely to miss out on a lot of things. So you don't, for example, just look at education policy. Education policy requires multiple things, including your industrial status, your, say, tourism, for instance. There's multiple things you have to think about. The same goes for foreign policy, because foreign policy is somewhat derived from or somewhat an extension of your domestic policy. It's somewhat reflective of your national objectives, your economic objectives, and all of that. And in that sense, I think tonight's conversation will have to take in a discussion of our national question regarding power sharing and devolution. We have to also understand, like someone mentioned, where we are. And I think it's important to see Sri Lanka beyond the conception of our geographical area, but also understand that we are in a very specific sphere. We are in India's sphere of influence. How have we acted as a small nation within India's sphere of influence, with our relationships with China, etc. And of course, we have to look at the future, right? Because it's all well and good to analyze the past, but Sri Lanka now seems, if I may use the word, aligned a little bit more with the Chinese hemisphere or the Chinese orbit. How does that look like going forward? We've looked at the last 2 decades of Chinese economic growth and seen that they are an obvious development partner for any nation, especially one like ours. How is the Chinese growth story looking in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years? How is it looking in the next 5 years? How are the demographic challenges in China going to come forward? So I think there's also a decoupling between the United States and China, which is going to cause major shifts globally, especially economic shifts. That's another thing we can discuss. I also think someone mentioned I don't know how many of my colleagues follow the current foreign minister and everything he says. I think if we look at our neighbors and Dr. Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister, I think you see how seriously even a nation as powerful as India is taking its diplomacy. Dr. Jaishankar is a seasoned diplomat, someone that is sort of draped in Indian foreign policy. And he has sort of recalibrated Indian foreign policy in such a way that it's worth looking at. And I think, I hope we can have a discussion about specifically what he brings to the table and what impacts he has, and perhaps compare him and his job to the job of our current foreign minister. But just to close off, Shamir, we are, as we said, we are in an economic crisis. Okay, so it's obvious that foreign policy will be tilted towards our economic objectives, and that's fair. But considering what I first said, where we are in the world, what's happening in the world right now, and I want to just say for our audience, for the benefit of the audience, that I'm technically a left progressive. I don't know how the rest of the panelists are. Progressives generally, in a Sri Lankan context or in a global context, we look at military spending, defense spending rather negatively. We think it's a waste of money. We think we should reduce it. I'm critical of our specific defense spending. But I just want to ask, given the position that we're in, given all the pressures globally, we need to really look at our defense spending and maybe rationalize it, maybe right-size it, maybe look at the finer points of surveillance, intelligence, counterterrorism, because I don't think it's as easy as saying, cut the defense spending and get our economy back on track, because let's face it, the defense ministry is also deterrent, and I think every country should have one. Thanks.
Kusum, I usually don't pose questions in the first round, but because you made a comparison with our foreign minister to the foreign minister of our neighboring country, India, I think it's only right for me to pose this question to you. India is a big nation. India is a very powerful nation. The foreign minister of India could act like that in terms of diplomacy. He could take a strong stand. Can the foreign minister of Sri Lanka, a little island nation, do that? Is it fair to come to that conclusion?
I think you have to understand that diplomacy is a tool. It's an instrument. It's of course a reflection of your relative economic power compared to someone like Jaishankar in India. But I don't think you have to necessarily...
Is it a fair comparison?
I think it's a comparison of expertise. I don't think there's anything to say that just because we're a less powerful nation than India that we shouldn't bring the best expertise we have in the country to a critical job. I think everyone will agree it's a critical job. We've just spoken about why it's a critical job. So should we, and with all due respect to Mr. Sabrian, I think his expertise as a legal, as an attorney, as a lawyer, I've heard he's a very good lawyer. With all due respect, I don't think he's equipped for the modern age of diplomacy and foreign relations.
Yeah, so I'm going to have a lot of questions to you, Kusum, as the show goes along.
Great.
So I'll leave it at that for the moment. I now move my attention to Dr. Harinder Vidanage, Head of Department, Strategic Studies, Kothalawala Defence University.
Shamir, thanks for having me. But I just wanted to start by trying to do a little bit of explainer. Now, we are talking about foreign policy, and in Sri Lanka, any forum, any conversation, people talk about foreign policy in such an abstract manner. I just wanted to say what it is, not just foreign policy, what policies are. Because I realized when we have conversations, people say we don't have a great foreign policy, we are in crisis, the policy. Then when I kind of have a conversation, I realize people are not sure what exactly we are talking about. So basically, the conversation we are going to have today is in the realm of what we call politics and strategy. That is the larger realm. In that larger realm, we talk about policies. Policies are things that states, governments adopt to achieve something. So in a policy, you try to achieve something, and it's about what you do and what you can't do also. So where does that come from? A policy is formulated based on your national interests, core values, core fundamentals any administration would represent. Then how does that translate into general policy? That is by that particular administration building consensus, building agreement, creating dialogues where there is support or opposition to that particular thing. And then that is all done within the realm of not just in policy but a state's strategic view of the world, if you're in the context of foreign policy. So what is strategy then? The strategy is basically trying to look at the existing realities, your existing strengths, and plan for a future. Look at a future that we don't see. So any criticism or appraisal of foreign policy happens in the context of whether you have achieved all of these things. Have you built a policy that is in line with your national interests, core values of the state? Is it going to achieve, as some of you said, the things like our economic progress, our sovereignty? Is it going to achieve? And how much of people support that, the consensus? So at each level, if you take Sri Lanka or many countries, there are debates. So I think it's good to tell this, then we know what we are discussing. I respect everybody's views, but I think sometimes what I realize, both from a strategic policy and education perspective, is we talk about these topics are in such abstraction in Sri Lanka, and sometimes though people are highly opinionated, when they come to fundamentals of what we are discussing, people are not clear. So I thought that my opening thing probably would be that this is what we are looking at. So how has Sri Lanka managed this? How has our foreign policy evolved? Where are we now? Are we in our expression of our current foreign policy, are we expressing what is actually our core values? Have we identified what our core values are, what our expectations are? Have we built an overarching strategy? Because most countries, if you look at, build policies based on a strategy that comes as either a national security strategy or a foreign policy strategy. For example, the US president has a national security strategy, and recently Russia just came out with its new concept of foreign policy, which is the guiding principle of Russian foreign policy moving forward. So that's kind of my thing. So I think we should, if we are to talk about foreign policy today and have an assessment, we have to come to this understanding this is what we are focusing on. So I thought I'll make my opening comments a little bit based on that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harindra Vidhanage, Head of Department Strategic Studies, Kothalawala Defence University. You can pose your questions to our panelists as well. The number once again, 076-656-5353. And I would be delighted to take those questions to our panelists today on the topic, the dangers of Sri Lanka becoming someone else's hub. I open the floor for questions from our journalists. On the immediate right is Shania. On the left is Jamal. Jamal, with your permission, shall we give the baton to
Yes,
Shania?
certainly.
Yes, okay, Shania.
Thank you, Shamir. Dr. Cook, I just wanted to direct a question to you. Given China's almost quasi-colonization of our ports and infrastructure projects, they are undoubtedly a mainstay in Sri Lanka. However, you know, with the IMF-backed loans that have been approved as well, they are primarily sourced from the US. So Sri Lanka has also become rather dependent on these loans for recovery. In your opinion, who is the biggest stakeholder?
We send the most amount of our export through the United States. We have a very important trade relationship with the United States, a very important investment relationship with China. This is where it's not a case of trying to give one priority over the other. We need to give priority to ourselves at this point. This is where very often we come across situations where we talk about people being pro-China or pro-America or pro-India or anti one of those three or some other countries. And we sometimes fail to ask the question, who's pro-Sri Lanka? Who are the ones who are in the process of promoting Sri Lankan interests and what is in the best interest of this country? They are there to look after what's in the best interest of their countries. We mustn't get that mixed up there. And this is where, quite unfortunately, we don't look at a situation and understand how are we going to ensure that we are going to get the best out of any kind of development that takes place on the world stage. Whether it be a situation with regard to Russia and Ukraine, whether it be American sanctions on Russia, whether it be India having an issue with China, those are very much what happens within their spheres of activity and engagement. How do we fit into that? Do we need to fit into that? Do we need to poke our fingers into their affairs? This is what we have to ask ourselves over and over again. Do we want to become pawns in their game of chess? No, we don't want to. We don't want anyone, we don't want to play anyone against anyone, and we certainly don't want to have a situation in which we are caught up in those games that other countries are playing out there. And this is where we've got to stop and ask ourselves, how have we done it in the past? Have we done it effectively? Have we failed? Or have we succeeded? And there are several occasions on which we have succeeded. We have worked very well with the Indians and Chinese. Maybe we might question as to whether we've worked very well with the Americans, Indians and Chinese. That might be a bit hard to find a time period in the past, but you never know. The deeper we dig, we're going to be able to find situations. But we don't want to come into a situation of we want to be your best friend or your best friend and have a problem with you. We don't want to get into those games. That is something that we've got to avoid, because you must remember we're a small player. They are large players, and we are just dispensable. They're working with each other in different areas, on different levels, in different areas with different countries. They're not looking at their bilateral relationship through the lens of Sri Lanka. We are not a part of that, and this is what we have to realize from our end.
So we have a question, George, for you from one of our viewers. Taking a look at our foreign policy, our recent foreign policy, has been basically how do we sell our national interests to the cheapest bidder for the highest commission. Is this an accurate statement?
That's not what we should be doing if we have been doing it. This is where when we look retrospectively at the past, we wonder, have we realized what we want to achieve with the outside world? We have not, as Pavitra mentioned, we have not clarified things domestically. We have no clear vision inside the country, and this has been a problem for quite some time now. We have not understood that priorities have gone for a 6, commissions have ruled, corruption has been deep-seated. These are things that we've had to contend with, and these are problems that are continuing to grow. But when we talk about what is in the national interest of this country, there are certain things that have to remain non-negotiable. This is where we've got to understand that if we don't stand up for our country, when we go in for a negotiation, if we go in for a discussion, if we are going to hope that the other side is going to have sympathy towards us, if we are going to hope that they're going to give us something by way of simply because of our size, that's not going to happen. They're coming in there with a proper plan of action of what they want to achieve. At the end of the day, we've got to go in there with the same thing. Walking into a negotiation and hoping that extending courtesies and warm hospitality is going to get us a long way is not going to work. That is not what we should be doing. So we certainly must not allow situations to unfold in which we are compromising our own positions, which has been happening, which continues to happen, and we hope will not happen. But of course, hope alone is not enough. We have to act on it. This is where we've got to call situations out and say that shouldn't be done. These situations should not be allowed. Are we doing that? That's the question.
So Pavitra, you spoke about where we have gone wrong. So George speaks about how continuously we are digging our own grave in terms of foreign policy. What are the salient problems that you've witnessed over the last few years in the Sri Lankan foreign policy framework?
So if foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy, a failure of foreign policy is also an extension of the failures of domestic policies, I suppose. As Dr. George said, I mean, for me, the main reasons would be whether we have defined what we really want. So I would look at foreign policy decision making as if, making decisions about anything that we would usually do. How would we make decisions? We would first think to be in a relationship with someone, to be in a friendship with someone, to have a contract with someone. We as individuals, as a company, as an institution, we first need to know what do we expect out of this, relationship. And then we would also think, what are the conditions? How deep we can go? What are the constraints that we would have? What are our calculations about the future of this, our counterpart, all that. So I think whether we have been visionary about our domestic policies, we have been talking about peace and development, but I doubt whether we have really thought about it seriously in terms of, making or keeping people at the center. In development for who? Peace for whom? Law for whom? Justice for whom? For whose sake that we are making decisions. I think that's where we went wrong domestically, because of politicization, corruption, multiple reasons that we have been talking for the last couple of months domestically. I think those are the exact reasons that have affected the failures of foreign policy as well.
So Dr. Mendis, I want to speak to you about having a very well-defined foreign policy moving forward. I believe, like Dr. Cook also mentioned in his opening remarks, it's important for Sri Lanka to know who we are and what we want out of our foreign policy. And personally, I believe for a robust foreign policy to be in place, we need to understand that we are safeguarding our national interests and also ensuring our autonomy as a state. However, over the years, after successive governments tinkered with this foreign policy, we seem to be in a state where we do not know what our foreign policy is. There doesn't seem to be an idea of what we want to achieve through our foreign policy. So how important do you think it is for us to introduce a robust national policy, as with every other aspect in the country, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to any healthcare and so on? How important is it for us to introduce a national policy on our foreign policy so that governments or a minority cannot tinker with it to achieve their interests?
Thank you for that question. First of all, I must preface your question that the domestic legal order and international legal order are two different things. At the domestic legal order, the policies are not made. I mean, now There are no policies. Now, when you draft, you say, anti-corruption bill, there is no policy dictate there. In most countries, there is a white paper or there is instructions by the bureaucracy. Here, you don't get it. Policy, not as a whole, even in regard to major issues that confronting Sri Lanka, there is no policy. It's instructions given orally or copying or scissors and paste. This is the style that Sri Lanka has developed, which is a very degrading way of doing things, you know. So as a result, we conflict our domestic law with the international standard. That is what is happening over and over and over again. I have worked in about 16 countries. In all these countries, when they do something like corruption, there is a huge policy directions given to me as a draft, as a person in charge of transforming the treaty standards into national law. But in Sri Lanka, there is nothing like that, I must tell you. It is either the draft is done by an outsider, whom we do not know who did it. There is no accountability of the person who did it. So this is some deficiencies in the system which cannot be rectified overnight. The system has gone down and down and down. When I left, Sri Lanka was a much better place. I was 40 years in African, Caribbean, Pacific countries as a major advisor. So I found even in those little 40 places, there was policy given by the bureaucratic or by the international system coming in before I start work. So that is why we have a problem. Once it is done, nobody claims that he is the author of this piece of legislation, so nobody knows who did it, and ultimately we are at the butt end of criticism because we have not conformed or managed to bring some conformity with the national standard and the international standard. So as a result, we are at a losing end every day and every night, you know, like that. And
how important is it to have a bipartisan policy when
very
it
important.
comes to foreign policy in a country?
You can have a policy, certain fundamentals. I mean, foreign policy is also, today you are my friend, tomorrow you are not my friend. I mean, Winston Churchill said, no, that it is difficult to say it should be written in stone because things do change in the international system as well as in the domestic system. So, but in regard to certain fundamentals, that we can have a foreign policy framework, that we must conform to international standard, that we must process certain things in a certain way, and before you make decisions, certain people have to be consulted, you know. Those are the mechanics of foreign policy making. In other countries, they have it. They have it. Even in darkest Africa, they had it, I must say.
Kusum, you spoke very eloquently in your opening remarks about it's important to look at the future and not the past. But unfortunately, when you speak about foreign policy, it's very important to speak about the past as well. Do you think that India has always thought of Sri Lanka in the best interest of our resplendent island nation over the last few decades? Let's talk about, let's look at the past. Let's look at the 80s and then move forward. I don't want to forget the past. I want to talk about the past as well.
Shamir, I think it's a good point, and I don't know if it will be controversial. I doubt it's controversial to the panelists here, but I think Sri Lankans, whether they know the full story or not, I think innately your average Sri Lankan does believe that India has had a significant influence in our political history, in our political structures.
Can we say negative influence?
Look, if you say negative influence, I'll give you an example. But there's positive influences as well. But since you mentioned the negative, I'll start with the negative, okay? I think we all know that in the 70s when there was ethnic strife in Sri Lanka, when there was a obvious wedge between two major communities, the Tamils and the Sinhalese. There's no question, and I think it's been written, Shiv Shankar Menon, Professor Rohan Gunaratne, Sri Lankan scholar operating out of Singapore, they've all written about this. India, somewhere in the 70s, perhaps under Indira Gandhi, perhaps even before, they decided that they wanted to get some leverage within Sri Lanka because they saw the way that things were going. Especially they noticed when there were, Tamil militancy coming up in the north. They realized
a safe haven to the paramilitary groups operating in the north of the country.
Well, I would go much further, and it's quite common knowledge. It wasn't safe haven. It was far more than that. I think there was training, and not just within the southern state of Tamil Nadu, which I think is what we generally accept. But there's been, I think there was a great podcast with Major Sapru, who is a former elite commander of the Indian elite forces. He served for the IPKF, with the IPKF in Sri Lanka. And he was talking about how even within his platoon, he was in charge of a pretty large platoon, they understood that India was playing a double game, that the center and the Tamil Nadu government were supporting the very people that they were going out to fight. And it's, I think there's a lot of evidence of a base just outside of Dehradun. Dehradun is in northern India, and that is one of the premier paramilitary training places, camps in India. And there's a lot of evidence that Prabhakaran himself received training there. So there was also a period which was uncovered about 10 years ago when there was a story about Indira Gandhi and how she set up plans to invade Sri Lanka. I think this would have been 1983, 1984, if I'm not mistaken. She had plans for the 5th paramilitary brigade to basically have an airdrop in Sri Lanka and capture the major airstrips. So this was the precursor to the F-15 fighters, the fighter jets that came to drop supplies to the north. So you can see that India, and there's a lot of evidence of various districts in Tamil Nadu being...
No, because we're talking about issues like territorial integrity.
Yes, yes.
We saw Sri Lanka's territorial integrity being violated in 80s.
Yeah.
When the drop happened, and that was completely out of the equation as far as Sri Lanka's territorial integrity is concerned. When we're talking about countries like the United States, which says and protects territorial integrities of other nations, we saw the manner in which Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan, in one of the provinces. So we're talking about all these good words, but we are forgetting the fact that are these countries really thinking about the best interest of Sri Lanka?
Shamir, I just want to pick up on something Dr. Mendes said as well about, friends and enemies. So I think it was Udita Devapriya, he might have been quoting somebody else, I'm not sure, but he said, in international relations, there are no permanent friends and enemies, only permanent interests. Okay, so we can't look at India as being friend or enemy. We have to understand what India's interests are. And we have to also, just to be fair to the period, I think there are certain states in which a country might lose its sovereignty. One of them is when it fails to protect its own citizens. Yeah. So we can't just blame India on their own. Yes, India took measures that I think are controversial and that I think have had an impact on Sri Lanka's history. But India also, as I said, we are in India's sphere of influence. We had internal strife. I think there's well-documented state failures to protect citizenry in Sri Lanka.
Let's look at something very simple, Kusum. Indian fishermen poaching Sri Lankan waters in terms of fishing,
Sure.
If India was so concerned about Sri Lanka, if they were so concerned about the minorities living in the north of the country, that is where the stop has to first happen. Don't you think so?
Yeah, well, if India wanted to stop the war, they could have at any point, couldn't they? There was even a process that went underway in the 90s, didn't work out. Prabhakaran was arrested in Madras in 87 or 88. He was released. So I think the Indian leadership, as you say, they know what's at stake in the region. So that's why I think going forward we'll discuss this. That's why when you put the Chinese port city on India's doorstep, or when you have the Magampura port handed over to a Chinese entity. So we understood in the 80s what India was willing to do to protect its interests. So now what have we done? Have we further sort of made things worse for ourselves with some of our recent foreign policy tilts towards China? I think it's broadly a policy of let's say the Rajapaksa administration to use China as sort of a bulwark against Indian pressure on our domestic 13th Amendment and devolution. Fine,
I think
that was a
India
reasonable
really,
strategy.
I think India really learned the bitter lesson after the killing of Rajiv Gandhi by the LTTE.
Yeah,
and they probably knew that is where they went wrong in terms of training the paramilitary groups in India over the period of time. Don't you think so?
No.
I think, well,
yeah.
You have got it a little wrong. I was watching in 1986 Bahamas Nassau conference where Commonwealth heads of states. At the time, Indira Gandhi justified intervention in Sri Lanka. At the same time, she went against United States for coming to Port Salinas in Grenada because under Maurice Bishop. Now the issue is this: India was at that time was not as friendly like today with the United States. So India felt that President Jawad, in his own thinking, that he could outsmart Gandhi's by being Vernon Walters, who was the main advisor to at the time it was, I think what was his name, the President of United States. I think it was Reagan, right, Reagan. So he began to realize that was not possible. He began to realize that was not possible, which hurt India beyond their conscience. That was a mistake done by our head of state. I must tell you, the truth of the matter is hidden, because then he shut up at that meeting and when this came up, and I was watching from the outskirts, and he said, we are not as small as Grenada, but that did not work well. So what I'm saying is that it was Mr. Jayawardana's mistake that propelled India to take that action.
So my next
They are
question,
looking at their security first.
so my next question is, Kusum, when you look at what's happening now in Sri Lanka and the relationship with India, when it comes to matters like the IMF, how India has extended credit facilities to Sri Lanka, do you still think there's a petty agenda behind all this? There's always an agenda.
You have to always assume that there's an agenda. I think even though we look at this, I think a few of the panelists have mentioned that foreign policy is about achieving some kind of economic prosperity or economic objectives while maintaining your sovereignty. There's another Sri Lankan, I think he's a professor of defense and studies. So he basically talks about, I think, Nilantan Nirushan, and he talks about how maybe foreign policy and economic sovereignty is a give and take. Maybe you have to sacrifice some level of economic sovereignty to gain something on the other side, maybe security, maybe economic security. So I'm not saying that that's what's happening, but if you just, now you mentioned Sri Lanka, what's currently happening, okay? So let's take a look at very recently. The LNG power plant, New Fortress, the Kerala-Pitya plant was sold, the treasury stake was sold to an American company, New Fortress Energy. The Trincomalee oil tank farm, which is, I think, also interlinked to the Indo-Lanka Accord. India has signed an agreement to develop the oil tankers. The Sampur solar power plant will also be run by the National Thermal Power Corporation of India. There are 2 renewable energy projects in Manna and another one in the north, given to Adani, another Indian company. So I wonder what my panelists think. Are we seeing sort of a shift in foreign policy in Sri Lanka, because these are all major Indian investments? America is an Indian ally.
So let's ask Harinder, do we see a major shift in foreign policy as far as this new government is concerned?
Shamir, I think, again...
Are we trying to rebalance what we've done with China over the last decade? Or?
No, I think let's go back. Of course, we have our foreign policy is not that great, but there are certain things. I think sometimes we live in collective amnesia in certain periods. The problem was we had a 30-year conflict that was going on. So I think the priority, strategizing, focusing was pretty much driven by the internal security compulsion. And I think the foreign policy or whatever foreign relations we adopted was in parallel. So the centralized focus on Sri Lanka was the domestic issue. But with respect, I disagree with most of these panelists about this. There is this mantra, foreign policy is an extension of domestic interest. That is half-truth. If you look at policy decisions by small powers, great powers, yes, you're primarily run by that, but always the external factor changes that. It's a reality for the US, it's a reality for India, it's a reality for us. So one of the problems, one of the challenges, one of the things we missed was coming to the end of the conflict. I think one of the major mistakes, not mistakes, that non-reading of India, of how India was changing. This is the thing, we talk of India as this monolith, homogeneous entity, which has not changed over time. That is one of the
but that change, Harinder, we saw happening after Congress was in power.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. So what
when the Congress party was in power during the height of the war in Sri Lanka.
But the Congress party was coming to the Congress was trying to do course correction. But the Congress was seeing their domestic political landscape was shifting, right? So what
there can be another reason, because Rahul Gandhi's father was killed by the LTTE in a bomb, in a terrorist suicide bomber. In May 21st. So that probably is one of the reasons why India was shifting its policy towards the LTTE and even Sri Lanka for that matter.
What I'm trying to tell, Shamir, it's not just about Sri Lanka. India was
as
changing.
A whole.
India as a whole was changing. That is see, this is the problem. That's why I said at the beginning, one of the major crises in not just our foreign policy, as George was, economic, everything, is the fact that we have never done a strategic assessment about, for example, our external challenges, because our strategic assessment was always very domestic, very internal, but because of the conflict mainly, right? So when we came out of it nearly 15 years ago, I think we are seeing what we call the changing of the Nehru-Gandhian worldview of India. So another thing about foreign policy is always the view how the leadership, whoever is in power, sees the world. Right? So that is why, for example, you had, when Trump was in power, the US Indo-Pacific strategy was there, but it was about America first. You get Biden, he will say institutions first. So there is always a change in the way the world was. So the worldview of Prime Minister Modi was significantly different from the worldview of the Nehru-Gandhian collective of whoever was in power, the Congress mainly. So,
but Manmohan Singh, for that matter, took a completely different view in terms of foreign policy in Sri Lanka.
It was a shift. It was a shift. Complete shift. But I think the change of government really has shifted India, and what India is, and how India sees itself. So as Kusum was trying to say, to the comparison between Jaishankar and Sri Lanka's forum is the fact that Jaishankar sees, that is the confidence that they have. There is a change in India. India would never have said. That is we are.
So after inviting the Pakistani foreign minister for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit,
he said, "I'm going
to look at the way Shiv Shankar Menon, really blasted
Jaishankar,
blasted.
So that's a different India. That's not the Nehru-Gandhian
saying that
India.
He was a spokesperson for terrorism.
So we have to understand that. I mean, what I'm trying to say is, if we want to consciously look about progressive, changing foreign policy, I think what we need to bring to today's table also is the fact that the debate in Sri Lanka about foreign policy is all about issues and matters. The reason is, we talked about bipartisan or multipartisan consensus. We can't build a consensus because there is no fundamental set of pillars of foreign policy. You were talking about a robust foreign policy. Robust foreign policies for small states are dangerous. But what we need is a robust set of pillars. So let's say we are the governing party, you guys are the opposition. We both have a common thing to debate, and we can say this is how we are going to look at national security, economic progress, foreign relations, migrants, diaspora relations. Look at Kenya's foreign policy. 7 pillars. It's a recalibrated foreign policy. So we know, everybody in Kenya knows, that's what we are going to debate on. So that's one of the missing things, Shamir, that...
Yeah, we will talk about that momentarily, but I just want to pick Pavitra's thoughts on this. So, what you said, Harinder said it was half truth, because you said that foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. Do you want to counter Harinder or
No,
Pavitra?
I think in a way it complements. When I say foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics, I think the arrangement of domestic politics, especially in a country like ours, we are a small state, is always affected by the systemic level, pressures. In terms of economic, I mean, we were in a dollar crisis. Why? Because dollar was the unit of the currency that we have been using. So it's but why we have been using dollars? We might have our own domestic interests in terms of development and all that. So I think I agree with what Dr. Harinder said, and when I say domestic politics policies, I don't mean that. I don't assume Sri Lanka as a very isolated, piece of land on earth, and we are very protectionist and we are just, our own. No, but definitely it is, our mindset, our strategic mindset, the way we look at the world, all that is influenced by the systemic level. May I add one more thing?
Yes, please. Yes.
I feel like going ahead with the topic that you have suggested for today's talk, the dangers of Sri Lanka becoming somebody else's hub, and I think the whole discussion about India suggests that somebody is probably is that India.
It could be the US, it could be China, it could be anyone.
Yeah. But I would also want to bring to the table, there could be some other hubs. And if we look at the hub in terms of the geographical, territoriality, we might not see those hubs. For example, what is the point of national security or, strengthening our border controlling and all that, if half of the population is trying to think of migrating to permanently settle in other destinations like, say Australia or Canada? What is the whole point of, all the policies that, we are investing in? So I think we should also look at, those types of probably not so traditional, circumstances that we are in, to think about Sri Lanka's security, what we are doing and what we are doing them for.
Dr. Cook, I wanted to ask you about India, since we extensively discussed the matter. How big of a stumbling block do you think the 13th Amendment has been in terms of good relations between Sri Lanka and India over the years? Because that seems to be a promise that was reneged upon first by Mahinda Rajapaksa and then subsequent governments. So what is your take on the 13th Amendment?
The 13th Amendment was jointly discussed. It wasn't something that only one side did. We had key people on this side of the divide also in the negotiation. If there is a problem with it today, let's also point fingers at people who were involved in the drafting of the 13th Amendment and what we raised at that particular juncture when they were drafting it. We went ahead and implemented it. We changed the constitution, we amended the constitution, we set up the provincial councils, we have had elections. In the past, we have done things. So it's not as though we have not implemented it. Maybe we have not implemented letter and principle to the T. Maybe that has not happened. As to whether this is a continuous irritant in the relationship with India, it's obviously for India a huge issue because this is part of their dealings with Sri Lanka, and they can't suddenly say that's not an issue anymore. They can't remove it from the table. It's on the table and we've got to accept it. So it depends on how we work around that, how we work together with India, or more importantly than working with India, what we do with it now, because now it is part of Sri Lankan law. It's not Indian anymore. It's part of the constitution. So it's something for us to implement. It's not for someone else or us to implement our own constitution. If we have put it into our constitution, go ahead and implement it. Otherwise, bring in another amendment and remove it. That would cause other issues somewhere.
George, you sound like Ranil Wickremesinghe.
If I may, Shamir, just one thing. I mean, I think the question was about the 13th Amendment, correct? So I wondered what our panelists think now. I think it's fairly easy to conceive of a situation where Sri Lanka signed the Indo-Lanka Accord under some level of Indian duress. There was some Indian pressure. There's even a conversation about whether, because technically we invited the intervention of the IPKF, but was that invitation derived from us by India through some sort of coercion, okay? That's a clear case to be made for that. In which case, I think if you look at Sri Lanka's recent political history, at least what I can remember, this devolution becomes a bit of a bludgeon to beat certain parties with. Some parties have, let's say Ranil Wickremesinghe is a great example because he's sort of run the gamut of Sri Lankan administrations since the 90s. One thing he's been very steadfast is in the need for devolution. What does his position, that of his UNP over the last 3 decades, and their inability or weakness, let's say, with the Sri Lankan majority, what does that say about this conversation around the 13th Amendment?
Unfortunately, Kusum, there is no UNP representative today on the show.
Unfortunately.
If not, I would have gladly taken that question and posed it to the panelists who are
here. If a nationalist or an ultra-nationalist were to say, this is something imposed upon us by India in the 80s when there was a gun to our head, why are we still looking at this? I think you can't dismiss that point of view. I think it's difficult. You can dismiss it up to a point, but then because we know, I think everyone around this table knows there's a kernel of truth to that. So I think there's nothing wrong with us trying to wrestle back some agency for Sri Lanka in this conversation around devolution. I think it's perfectly possible to agree in the concept of power sharing and devolution of power, but look at that away from the 30th Amendment. The 30th Amendment is not the only instrument of devolution. It's one instrument that's been introduced to us. So I wonder if what our panelists might.
But I believe
Shall I just come?
Yes.
Because I know the draft very well. It was done by Mr. Partha Sarthi, who was an Indian diplomat and a civil servant. If you look at it very carefully, there are certain phrases which are relevant to India and not to Sri Lanka. That itself shows our legal arm did not look at it properly. It's a failure on our part. If we had put up a proposal to modify it, I'm sure Partha Sarthi would have...
Dr. Nellis, there were also letters of exchange.
Yeah, letters of exchange. Whatever it's that, this whole framework that was conceived was accepted by us. We were given an opportunity, but our party failed to modify or do anything at that point of time. So it is not that India put us in this position by force. They gave us a chance to go through it. It was our failure to
Chance is subjective. No.
Huh?
Chance is a subjective.
Subjective because they were also divided. No, our cabinet at that time was also divided.
Our cabinet has always been divided. No.
Divided, but at the time it was
only during Mahinda Rajapaksa's time it was united. and 16, 18, 19,
I think
amendment they voted in favor.
Disanayaka went along with the president and Lalit and the Prime Minister at the time, Viradasa was against, and they never attended that particular meeting.
So I just want to, George was saying something about 13th Amendment. I interrupted you and I said, you sounded like Ranil Wickremesinghe because in a recent statement, Ranil Wickremesinghe said the same thing, saying that if the 13th Amendment has to be repealed, it has to be done through a constitutional reform. It has to come through an amendment in Parliament. And when you said that, George, you sound exactly like Ranil Wickremesinghe. And probably that is why Kusum thought that it would be apt for him to ask you a question about the UNP. but
certainly, I don't know whether to take that as a compliment or an insult, but we'll deal with that later. But I'm not privy to that statement that he made.
Yeah.
But certainly, it is now part of Sri Lankan law. That's what we've got to accept. The Indians may be talking about it, may be raising it at meetings and saying, what are you doing for the 13th Amendment? How far are you going? That may be happening because they were involved in the crafting of it, putting it together. But at the end of the day, now it's our baby. It's in our courts, and it's talking about power sharing, short of going into a federal system. So this is where we are seeing.
That's an important point because, sorry to interrupt, but why is federalism also still part of the conversation? We've seen many members in Parliament talking about federalism. Why is it part of the conversation when the 13th Amendment clearly says devolve power within a unitary state, and then federalism and the unitary state has a contradiction there. So
why a lot of opponents of the 13th Amendment seem to attribute the full implementation of the 13th Amendment as the creation of a federal state.
And it's not the case.
No, it's not.
Exactly. There seems to be a confusion.
Understand first and foremost, Chairman, what is federalism and what is the 13th Amendment.
And what is devolution of power?
What is devolution of power? What is power? That is the things that we've got to understand first before we go beyond that. But this is where we can't be looking at India only through the prism of 13th Amendment and talking about that. There's a lot more to India than the 13th Amendment. India looks at us also, there's a lot more to Sri Lanka than the 13th Amendment. It is on the table. It's something that we can't remove from the India-Sri Lanka bilateral table. At the end of the day, it's there.
So, George and Harinder, now we saw on the 5th of April 2022 there was a government decision to close down embassies in Norway, Iraq, the Consulate General in Australia from the 30th of April. Now, this was a sudden decision taken by the government at that time because of the looming economic crisis that was plaguing the nation. However, there seems to be politicians' daughters, sons, working at missions overseas. How sad is that, George? You've been in the Foreign Service and you were to be a career diplomat. That is why I asked you in my earlier remarks, in my opening questions to you, how long were you serving as a career diplomat? But don't you think this is sad?
It is miserable. As far back as 2014, when I ended my term in Paris, I was replaced by a political appointee who had no clue about what had to be done. And then you have a politically appointed ambassador as well as diplomats who are politically appointed. Sri Lanka is really in a bad situation at that point. This is continuing. Closing the mission in Norway was one of the biggest mistakes that administration made, simply because of the fact that Norway is a country with which we have had history, we've dealt with them, they've come here, they've been involved in the peace process, they've been involved. You don't want that to become a safe haven, if you know what I mean, for certain regroupings to take place. But you're laying the foundation for that. Very short-sighted. If you want to save some dollars here or save some dollars there, stop sending the offspring, stop sending neighbors, stop sending your jogging partners, stop sending your university buddies. That is what should stop.
If I can also come in there, I mean, it's, yes, stop sending your relations, but also if someone was serving your family as their lawyer, what is his position? What is his qualifications
usually,
to become?
No,
I'm going to ask you.
I think it is a
Dr. Mendes,
just
for a second, I just want to ask a follow-up question from Kusum, and then I'll get back to you. Kusum, usually, when a government is appointed, it's the government politicians' daughters or sons who are posted to these embassies or consul generals or whatever it is. But in Sri Lanka's case, this time around, it was a bit different. You know why? There was an opposition politician's daughter who was posted to a foreign country overseas, like to an overseas posting.
More than one, Shami.
More than one. So, what is that? It seems like what Ranjan Ramanayake always says, "Me okkama yaluva malli," seems to be true.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that has been observed internationally as well, because
no, forget about international. This is observed in Sri Lanka.
Even in Sri Lanka, I think, take the Ceylon National Congress, the precursor to Sri Lanka's parliament. There was not much of an ethnic issue in that body because it was all elites, whether Tamil, Sinhalese, Muslim. They were all from the same social strata. They knew how to get along perfectly well. So I think, again, every country, including Sri Lanka especially, has a group of elites that are sort of, they've become part of the furniture. So whoever comes into power, you will see X, Y, and Z in certain positions. And that's a huge problem. It's one thing to send your children, but okay, assume that's for a limited period and it's for experience, building a CV, whatever. Your foreign minister, your deputy foreign minister, there'll be a state minister of something else. these are not things that you should.
That
just
is not
take.
acceptable, Kusum, at all.
You cannot send your children. You cannot send your children, whatever strata of society
There's no
you
way
belong
that we
to.
can justify
shouldn't
that.
be a right.
There's no
Absolutely
way
not.
that there can be any justification on that.
Other countries have politically appointed ambassadors.
So
Not first secretary, second secretary, third secretary, stenographer, driver, and everyone else. You don't have that happening in other countries.
And
But
this
I
is-
give a caveat because there are times the politically appointed ambassadors have performed much better than
they've done well.
done
They've
well.
done.
I can give you few
There are
names.
plenty of names.
Plenty of names.
Not one. There are
Plenty of names.
And that is why George said, if it's an ambassador, it's okay.
Yeah.
But when it comes to technical,
Yes, this I don't condone. This I agree with the
So,
my
Kusum, it's like-
learned colleagues that at that level, giving an office second secretary for the first secretary, it
Because
should come through the foreign service
In
process.
2020, I remember, veteran singer Rohan Abedage was approved to be posted for the post of ambassador to the Maldives. So,
Didn't President Citizen offer Sangakkara? I mean, just on a whim at the presentation ceremony.
but the question is, so I'm sorry to get back to you
Go
on
for it,
this.
go for it.
but because you wanted to talk about the UNP, I thought it's only right for me to ask you a question about the SJB as well.
Sure.
So it seems it's a rainy day for the SJB, don't you think? You know, when you speak about, I know it's not about foreign policy, but there are many members of the SJB politicians' daughters who are posted at foreign missions.
That's the problem. That needs to change.
That needs to
question.
change. Yeah, there's no. Are we on the same page on that?
Of course.
Yeah, we all.
All right. Harinder, now, interestingly, we're talking about foreign policy, the importance of foreign policy. You spoke about drafting a foreign policy. What are the salient features that come to your mind when you say about drafting a foreign policy? Because we speak about change, and people are of the opinion that this is the best time to make that change. And don't you think the current foreign minister has to be cognizant about those changes that need to be rolled out as far as foreign policy is concerned? So if you were to advise him, what would be your advice to the foreign minister?
I think, Shamil, the reason being that we are seeing this is like a conjuncture, because it's not just for Sri Lanka, but regionally and globally, I think the last few years brought in unprecedented changes where countries had to rethink a lot, mainly because of the pandemic and now because of the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict. Both have totally messed with all the assessments countries have made about their own foreign policies and domestic policies. So for example, India has to keep on answering why they are not criticizing or bringing anything up against Russia in the context of Ukraine, and when all the whole geostrategic bloc, Western bloc, is supporting Ukraine.
But at that time, Jaishankar Menon thought that Russia was doing a good job.
Sorry.
The foreign minister of India at that time thought it's right to even bring down oil from Russia because it was the best interest of India.
And he
at that
justified that.
Yeah, he justified that.
This is the India. I will come back to the question, but this is the India we have to understand. That's what he said. India. This is the India we have not understood. India is the fastest growing economy. India is one of the fastest growing military modernizations. It has one of the strongest, I think, strategic partnerships with the United States, with France, with Russia. So it's the recently concluded BECA, the final piece of strategic agreements with the US, gives it access to very sophisticated US satellites. So
Major defense partner they've become.
yeah, they are at the 2+2. So for example, an Indian missile between 2020 and now is 100 times more accurate than it was before. I'm just telling you. So we have to understand the scale. And India, the other thing we don't understand, of course we keep on 13th Amendment here, but the future challenges. India will be the most populous nation on earth, right? And it will be the youngest nation on earth. The median, I think, age will be 26 or 28, right? When China will be 50, they will be like that. So, which means for Sri Lanka, that's also a challenge. right? Because if you look at the way our the composition is. So coming back to that question, I think every country is forced to rethink their foreign policies, and especially for Sri Lanka, right? Because we didn't have certain fundamentals in place, right? Fundamental in place, we now have to at least, I think, if the foreign minister or the administration wants to look at a strategy 5 to 6 years ahead, I think the general thing is 2030. So they're looking at a 2030 reboot of this. And in a recent conference I brought this out, was kind of received, I think Ambassador was there. A lot of people, there's one thing we have to remember, a strength of Sri Lanka. No matter how we can debate, is Sri Lanka is the oldest democracy in Asia. In 2031, it will be 100 years. We are hitting the centenary of the democracy experiment in whole of Asia. That's, Sri Lanka has been lacking a future aspiration or hope. We have been going on so many slogans, but been very unrealistic. See, there is a realistic slogan after a long time, right? A Vision 2031. So I kind of, it's a personal view I had, but I think this idea since the democratic experiment and the centenary, I think we can create, if this government can at least create consensus on at least the pillars and bring out, it's a very harsh thing, very difficult thing. It's not just the foreign policy minister alone can do. This has to be brought to the parliament. They have to bring a set of, at least a skeleton version of that to the parliament. As I said at the beginning, that is why I said at the beginning, without consensus, you can be the most powerful leader in this country, your policy, your thing will fail.
So, Dr. Yeah, go ahead.
Just adding on to the question that Shamir asked you, how important is Sri Lankan neutrality? Do we know where we stand regarding our allegiances, or does our vulnerability mean that we just drift towards whoever benefits us?
Yeah, I think one of the perils of using ideological slippage like neutrality is the fact that it actually I think stifles us. That's the problem. Neutrality as a fundamental killer of foreign policy is okay, but that doesn't mean, neutrality does not mean we are going to just stay non-engaged, right? I think, for example, the Russian foreign policy, new one, it says multi-vectoral engagement. Russia is willing to engage in different vectors. So Sri Lanka has to engage, right? We have tier one, what I call tier one partnerships. The United States, India, China. It's tier one. We should not play them against each other, but we should engage all of them. So there is no question about it. So to do all of that, you need at least consensus that is built in the legislature about a foreign policy.
So Kusum, there was
that is my advice, Shamir, if I want to give you.
Kusum, but if you look at it, give me a second, Jama. So if you look at it, even foreign policy, Dr. Mendes, has come into a very big question as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, because we saw the manner in which how Sri Lanka has always supported Palestine, the Palestinian cause, right throughout. But we saw in 2016, the government did not vote when it came to an issue with regard to the Palestinian question. And at that time, the foreign ministry spokesperson, Mahesh Nikolono, stated that contentious wording in the text prompted Sri Lanka to abstain from voting. And their stand on Palestine has not changed. But we see mixed signals when it comes to Sri Lankan foreign policy. Over the last few years, may it be the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration, may it be the Maithripala Sirisena administration, may it be the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration, now it's the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration. Don't you think these mixed signals have prompted Sri Lanka to be looked differently by many states?
Yes, certainly. But this saying that it does not is not clear, or whatever the words used by the Ambassador Colonna, I don't know, you just said, no, that's something wrong with the wording. That is why they are not voting. Am I right?
So the resolution itself refers to Israel throughout as the occupying power and criticizes its policies around the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in East Jerusalem. The compound, as you know, Dr. Mendes, is one of the holiest sites for Muslims across the world.
Yes. So I think now it's a contentious issue, but still the Palestine issue has gone through our decision-making process many times. In order to change it, there must be some very strong discussion in Parliament. No, I mean, that is what we need. So when you put the constitutional fundamentals of a foreign policy, we can't draft everything into that foreign policy.
But
if you look at EU, have you seen the EU foreign policy? Have you seen it?
Yeah, that's what
you saw that. I'm trying to tell you, it's an excellent job.
Yeah.
Excellent job they have done. Only the fundamentals.
Only the fundamentals. Only
the fundamentals sign it. And I have studied it and I've gone through it. So I think if you have something like that,
that's what I was
she would have been refrained from making that decision.
Shamir, just to jump in, because we don't have this, our foreign policy discussions and deliberations and critiques is about the driver, the daughter and everything. That should not be the conversation.
Absolutely.
The conversation should have been, what is the stance on the Indo-Pacific? How are we going to deal with? The Americans have come with, they are refreshing a strategy. The Indians are looking at this. So how are we going to deal with? Instead, in the Parliament, we are saying, that's the conversation. That is why because we don't have it. Because we don't have it, foreign policy debates are all about petty things.
And if they have a clause saying only ambassadorial appointments can be made outside, and all other appointments should come through the foreign service process. Match over. They can't abuse the process.
So what is our policy on port users? What are our policies on the military replenishment? What is this? So we are calling out, you're talking about a hub. So do we have a policy on those things?
So Dr. Vidanage, I think a couple of minutes ago you mentioned India and the US striking a defense partnership. Am I right?
Yeah, it's a strategic, not defense, strategic partnership.
Strategic partnership.
They call it strategic partnership.
While India is doing so, on the other hand, India is also a major player and a part of the BRICS nations, right? Which is a huge advocate for de-dollarization and countering US influence. So balancing both of these and navigating these tricky waters seems to be, India seems to be doing a good job in terms of doing that. So being a very close geographically and also having close ties with India, what sort of lessons can Sri Lanka learn from India's foreign policy that we can adopt and ensure that we cater to the best interest of us and also to partner nations?
This is the thing I was trying to tell Jamal about we're not doing an assessment. So in the last 10 years, again, we have been focusing on big power rivalry. That fact that the Chinese and the Americans and the Indians, that's not the case. What the Ukraine war and both the COVID pandemic shows is the fact that how countries that didn't think of strategic autonomy, we call this strategic autonomy. When the Indian foreign minister tells the foreign press, European problems are not our problems, we deal it in a different way, he's not discounting that. He's addressing two things. One, he's saying India has a autonomic, India's strategic interests are aligned with India's domestic. That's why I think Pavitra and
they have a predefined set of strategies.
At the same time, they're saying we understand there's a duplicity. When you talk about the West has a duplicity, he's exposing that, right? But at the same time, they are forging strategic alliances. But in ways benefits India. So you have the European arms manufacturers has to sell, Indians will buy 1/3. 2/3 should be made in India. So they have to build a plant in India. That will bring money, jobs, and the technological know-how. Right? That's how India is managing that. And so it's not just India. So what you see is in the last few years, because of the shake, what's happening, the big power rivalry is not just a big thing. Within that, the sort or the pursuit of strategic autonomy by countries like India, France, in Europe. That's why Macron said America's problem should not be Europe's problem.
Yes.
after visiting China. So we have to understand this. So we have to understand these dynamics, and so we should not be kind of creating these siloed mentalities. We also, I mean, I'm not trying to say Sri Lanka could have strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is capable when you are strategically important. We have this location mantra, which I think is a bit of a myth. So Sri Lanka, I think as the answer I gave, I think our thing is the engagement. We should be proactive about engagement. I don't think so even to do that we need kind of some policy at play which justifies this. Otherwise we cannot do engagement. For example, if we do an American project, there will be some people shouting we are pro-American. If you do a Chinese thing, some people will say Chinese colonization. So that's the problem, because we don't have a central set of policies.
So George, when you look at what's happening in the world right now, we're talking about de-dollarization topic as well. We're talking about how the BRICS are going to come together to bring in a common currency to deal with the world in terms of the dollar. You see countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa coming together on this front. But what I don't understand, George, is the fact that India, which doesn't see eye to eye with China, agreeing on something of this sort. Why?
This is where these countries are working together, Shamir, on a lot of areas. We completely miss the bus when it comes to understanding them. We think that India and China are enemies. China and America are enemies. In India. Indian Prime Minister was the chief guest, naturally. And he talks about how the AIIB has done so much for India and other countries. And he says, you've invested so much now, by 2020 invest so much, by 2025 invest so much. This is the future, this is where we're going. Now, anyone watching that will wonder, India, China having issues? I have visited the Chinese nuclear facility, Shamir, in which there were two people who obviously did not resemble stereotypical Chinese. And there were two American scientists. What are two American scientists doing in a Chinese nuclear facility? Have they been smuggled in there? Have they been kidnapped and held at gunpoint and asked to work in there? There's collaboration taking place. This is where we must not get involved in these countries' problems. They are working together at different levels because they see the future. They see where we are going. India and China working together obviously see the realization of the Asian century. The Asian century is not going to be done by one country alone. India is going to play a very big role in that.
But definitely Pakistan and India are not working together.
Yes.
No, Shamir, I think what I'm not disagreeing with George. What you don't understand.
You're disagreeing with George.
I'm not disagreeing.
Not,
but it's partially disagreeing.
Very diplomatically saying that.
No, we worked together for 5 years and we have this, so we have a fight. So the point is this. After the Russian Revolution, Lenin sent Russian engineers to visit Ford plants and work there. So the point is this, there is always economic interdependence, there is this working, and for example, this year George is trying to say 2018, you know, if you look at the phone market in India, right, if you look at the number 1, 2, 3, all were Chinese companies, of course, because they have, and the Indians demanded. So the Indians were thinking that was great. Then India, you know, last year they really started, you know, panicking because the Indians thought they demanded the Chinese to invest. So the Chinese were giving the Indians jobs, but 90% of the profit was transferred back to Beijing. So in the same process, the Chinese, this is the mobile phones, they decimated the Indian brands. Indian brands phone for example, market value has dropped to 2%. While Xiaomi, Realme, they were the market leaders. That's why, and this opportunity was seized by the Americans. That's why they set up Apple plants, and they are also strategically shifting some of the manufacturing away from Taiwan and all. If there's a war that breaks out, because Taiwan believes they are living under a silicon shield, but I don't know how long that's going to hold. So India, I agree with George. India and China has to work together because I think they together represents the world's largest population and world's largest affluent middle class. So trading wise, you need each other. But strategic wise, you have the line of control, you have Galwan Heights, you have them fight, you have troops being positioned, the most modernized militaries, all the new Indian inventions. The most modern one is the light attack helicopter. That has the world's highest flying ceiling for any attack helicopter in the world. Why? They should be able to fly with the Himalayan peaks. So they have found that the strength the Chinese have is their armor. So the attack helicopters are armor killers. So that is the strategic thinking behind this kind of.
Yeah, I think the point is that neutrality isn't the absence of strategy.
Yeah,
you have to remain neutral, sure.
Yeah, but strategy.
But that doesn't mean your strategy is reactionary. That doesn't mean that when one country does thing, you pivot to one direction, and then you take a different stance, and another country does something else.
Yeah.
So India, for instance, is a great example. India manufactures with Lockheed Martin, I think Tata and Sons. They manufacture the F-16 fighter jet, the US fighter jet wings in India. At the same time, in a different factory, they manufacture Russian tanks under license. So if you can do both.
BrahMos.
And look at Iran and Qatar, two, I think, peoples, the Shias and the Sunnis, that have had millennia, maybe 1,000 years worth of conflict. But when they discover an oil field, I don't remember the name of the oil field, the offshore gas field, they work together to extract it, to share the resource.
That's why Saudi Arabia created a problem in Qatar.
Exactly.
No, but my point is, I'm sorry, so 1 minute. So George is correct about this, interactions. But when it comes to strategic matters such as, for example, the line of control, the Indians, that is why India is going with strategic partnership with the US and all. They know these are areas that they can't negotiate with China. So there's security, there is no security guarantee, right? Because the Chinese have crossed the line, the Indians have crossed the line, so there has been skirmishes. There has been a de-escalation, but that doesn't, core national interest of India. We talk about Sri Lanka sovereignty and we don't have it. India doesn't have sovereignty as well. India has contested about 4,000, 5,000 kilometers of a border that is contested. Imagine that. So that is one of the biggest, for example, stumbling blocks where India and China will be very difficult.
Please jump in. I've also been trying to understand Indian foreign policy, or rather specifically external minister's approach during the last couple of months or years. And I built up an explanation for myself to think that probably India is considering a decolonial approach towards the world. And this is, and why we find it difficult to understand, because it's far beyond binary way of understanding world politics. We have always been taught or trained or fed to look at world in blocks, west or east, communism versus democracy, white, black, so rather developed, not developed. So the way that we look at the world, when I say we, I mean all of us, is that you are either with that block or with the other block. You are either a friend or an enemy, and that comes from the Cold War politics for me. And that's why when India buys oil from Russia, Western world is very panicked about it, and they ask and they wonder, how did India bought oil from Russia while Russia is a friend of China? Because for West, China and Russia is one block, and when India buys oil from Russia, it's a problem about India's relationship with China. So I think a better explanation, at least I built up for my own self to understand.
No, I will. When you finish, I will compliment that. No, I have a. I'll just answer, compliment. No, I will compliment that because I'll let you finish.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. So I think it's for me. I think we are living in a Western world. The rules of the game has been designed by the Western world, whether we like it or not. The European history, colonialism, Western, America becoming the leader, and the way that we look at the world, the standards that we set, the parameters we set for the standards for development, standard for perfect life, the American dream, and all that. I think we think those are personal, but those are for me constructed by various historical forces. that have strong Western biases. So from that point of view, I would really like the India's very adventurous foreign policy because the problem is this: it's very difficult to explain to a group of us, the audience, the world audience, because we have already been trained to think about world politics in either or position. India's position cannot be fit in either that or this, and that's probably why we get confused what India is up to.
Yeah, and just to, before Dr. Handaram, Dr. Jayashankar said his exact quote was, India does not think in terms of blocks and alliances. That is a Western terminology. That was his exact sense. That's how you.
So that is why if you just check up the G20 theme for India, which is coming up, the next G20 meeting is in India. One family, one future, one. So suddenly India is bringing what you call the Asiatic value, and then you go to Xi Jinping, shared values, harmonious society. So this is a Asiatic way of understanding things. But I agree with Pavitra. We bring the Asian values, but strategically, they all look at the world from that particular perspective.
They all have an agenda at the end of the day.
No, strategically, the way the West, I mean, strategically, their strategies are Western.
So George, I'm talking about China now. We spoke a lot about India. So the Chinese built the Hambantota port at a cost of $1.2 billion US dollars. When it came for sale, they only paid $900 million US dollars. So where was this $300 million US dollars in your opinion?
I have no idea. I was not privy to that deal either.
So don't you think corruption in Sri Lanka is the root cause of diplomacy, of all the problems in the country? Isn't that the real problem that we're talking about? Look at the impunity that is taking place in Sri Lanka. Isn't that
continues to take place? Continues to take, not took place. It continues to take place, and this is where we are not seeing an end to it. People just don't care for the country. When we look at the Indian example, look at the Chinese example, you're seeing people who are involved in policy formulation or the implementation, who for them, China comes first, no questions asked. India comes first, no questions asked. When it comes to our side of the table, we're worried about what will China say about India, what will we say about someone else. We're completely caught up in something very different here. And so then it's countries way down the list of priorities. It's me, myself and I, and then my family. And that's where I disagree with Dr. Vidanage. We have to talk about the appointments of sons, nephews, nieces and people, because that affects the foreign policy.
We disagree with Dr. Harinder as well.
You can't go and talk about ports in the world.
I didn't say not to talk about it. I said that it will not be the only conversation if we had a strong set of foreign policy, the
fundamentals.
Of course, that is globally. Even when in the British Parliament, when somebody used a luxurious room in a hotel, that became a debate. I'm not disagreeing on that. I'm saying is that will not be the only thing, apart from this conversation. So it's a poverty of the debate that I was.
But people who've been sent out there are not capable to deal with those issues.
So when I was reading up about the coronation of King Charles, I saw an article which was published on social media that in 1937, 12th May, when the coronation of King George took place, even at that time when Sri Lanka was under British rule and Sri Lanka was a colony, in the legislature, when they want to take a message to the king at that time from Sri Lanka, being a colonized nation, there was an individual with the name Mr. Wickramasinghe, not Ranil Wickramasinghe, Mr. Wickramasinghe, who was known as Atamas at that time in the Sri Lankan political fora, was against it. Was against taking that message to the British Empire at that time. So it shows that Sri Lanka was not a nation that was always bowing down to international pressure, isn't it, Dr. Mendes? We've always sometimes had a stand as well of our own. If you look at the non-aligned movement, we were the pioneers of the non-aligned movement. But today, as Dr. George said, we don't have any. We don't know whether we are non-aligned or not anymore. We don't know. The policies of Sri Lanka has diminished to such a level individuals, even in the parliament, wouldn't know what their policy is, the foreign policy of Sri Lanka is. Don't you think so?
Yes, that is because we have undermined that the law as an instrument of regulations. You know, we have undermined, we have not set standards in regard to certain matters. So doing something like a drafting of foreign policy relating to fundamentals can have, I don't say it will be implemented up to every comma, and this thing will have an impact on the system,
Definitely.
which will prevent them from doing it. So now you brought that going to the function, it's a matter of taste. No? I mean, it's not a big deal whether you are going to the coronation or not. I mean, after all, the British ruled us for 150 years. A new king is born. A bit of a modern king in a sense that, not like the ancient kings. At least they are written about the environment and written about.
I would love to.
I have the
those
book.
Remarks,
I got a book from him actually.
I would love to take all these messages very positively.
Yes,
Dr. Mendes. If
because
Sri Lanka was not in this state right now, because of politicians, look at Ranil Wickremesinghe has served the Sri Lankan Parliament for more than 45 years. Look at Mahinda Rajapaksa has served Sri Lankan Parliament for nearly 50 years. Look at the state that we are in as a nation today. We're talking about sons, daughters of politicians being appointed to foreign missions overseas, when there are people who are very well educated, who could steer the country's economy, as you mentioned in your earlier remarks. It's about economic diplomacy as well. What have the foreign missions overseas done to the Sri Lankan economy? If you look at the foreign missions that are established in Sri Lanka, they speak about trade partners. They want to promote tourism. They want to promote business. They want to promote investments. What are the FDIs that foreign missions in Sri Lanka has bought the last few years? Tell me one, Dr. None.
None.
That is because we don't have professionals.
They also don't know how to focus, where to go, what to do.
Dr. Mendes, is that our problem? That is not our problem.
Yes.
That is the problem of the politicians. And that is why I'm saying we are in this state today because of the politicians who have ruined us.
Then it becomes our problem.
Then it becomes our problem. Now see, I went to the office where the port city is. Now I have worked with port cities a lot across the world. And I didn't find, I asked, where is the directory of all companies working in other port cities? This is the Bible in any port city. He said, we don't have it. So how are you going to make contacts and invite them? With one letter properly written, you can send it once to the whole, and something will strike with these brochures.
Dr. Mendes, if you may recollect, in Parliament last year, when the Port City Economic Commission bill was taken up, there was a minister who's now a strongman of this government who went on to say that by 2025, Sri Lanka would earn $25 billion US dollars in foreign direct investment. What nonsense is this, Dr. Mendes?
But what is wrong with this?
What is this? Why are we hoodwinking the people at the end of the day?
Because
that's not right.
They are so ignorant. They don't understand. I sent this bill to Bahamas. They said it is suitable to go into the waste paper basket. There's no clarity in it. There's no clarity in that bill. So there is no in which you can market. Lord, what was his name? The famous parliamentary council said once, the laws must be drafted in the same way as razors are made to sell. No, what does it mean? What does it mean? I'm asking you. What does it mean? Laws must be drafted as razors are made to sell 150 years ago. What does it mean? It means that whatever the law drafted, it should be marketable. If the razors don't cut, they will not sell. Because those days, 150 years ago, they all had beards like you know. But today, they are clean shaven, but even Disraeli had a beard.
No, the problem
so this is what I'm saying. It must be drafted in a way it can be sold. It is not done that here.
The problem that we have, Dr. Mendes, as journalists, is the fact that all missions have to be driven by KPIs.
KPIs.
You know, it has to be the case. Now, when George spoke about his scenario, when he wanted to do his PhD,
Yes.
and the minister or the secretary or whoever, George, didn't allow you to do that,
Yes.
that wouldn't ever happen in a private sector company.
No.
They would have always promoted you to do that job. I don't know about your political affiliations, George, but I'm just saying, it wouldn't have been the case. It wouldn't have been the case. You would have been propelled to do it. I come from a private sector company as well, and I work for a very well reputed company, and they always promote you, push you to do your studies, to cushion yourself. Now individuals like Shania, who are working as part-timers, are going to the US to study.
Yes.
That is because companies of the private sector allow you to do that. Allows you to, yes, Dr. Yes.
Jump in. I think if we want to find an immediate solution for this problem,
Yes.
I can be too ambitious. But I think, the common problem in Sri Lanka is that the public investments are being wasted. There is I understand a society as a circle. We are a country with very unique welfare, facilities, but also indirect taxation. So public taxation, public money is being collected and invested in, so that certain industries, certain sectors can work really very well, right? Public sectors. Now, when you look at the circle of this particular thing, foreign policy, foreign services, diplomatic relations, Sri Lanka's foreign policy, I think the circle has to be people invest their public money, and that is being used in a very wise way to make foreign policies, and eventually that benefit will again come back to the public. Now this circle clearly doesn't work in that way. As many of us said, politicization is one problem. So the accountability between the public investment and delivering the foreign policy has been somewhere cut. One is, as we said, the postings are wrong. The people who are in the job, they don't really understand what they're doing. They don't have accurate calculations. And the main point that I want to highlight is that in Sri Lanka, the academics who are working on international relations, foreign policy, all that, work on their own, and there's no collaboration between the academia, researchers, scholars. Not that they're the greatest people on earth, but they do some work, and there's no cooperation, no alignment, no connection between them and practitioners. Now, I work at the Department of International Relations at the University of Colombo. We produce honors degree students who learn international relations for 4 years. There's no connectivity between them and the foreign services. Foreign services people are being recruited in a separate examination. So why we offer that honors degree, spending a public money, assuming that this group of people who have that expertise knowledge on this particular thing will utilize it in that related sector. Instead, they will work in some other, unrelated jobs, which is also good, but the public expectation is not being made. So I think one thing that if we want to immediately find ways would be a good conversation between academic people, scholars, researchers with practitioners. I feel like the foreign ministry and some related authorities are not interested in it. Might be because it is a highly politicized place already, and that they would prefer to work by themselves. Although
can
you
I
would
add something to that, Pavitra?
Yeah.
I think the observation. This comes to the exam foreign, and George's example of when the foreign secretary said, "I have maths, science,
BSc.
maths." No, this is teaching IR in US and working with the diplomatic community. Recently, I met a Canadian diplomat, and also this is something I saw in the US as well. There was a huge demand in the US in liberal arts, politics, government, international relations, the highest demand subject, right? Because they all expect them to go to work in congressman's office and all things like that in think tanks. And then this Canadian diplomat told me, in Canada, when you apply for foreign service, number one preference is given for social science students, right? This is taboo in Sri Lanka, this conversation, right? So we have international relations department in Colombo. There is international studies in Kelaniya. We have strategic and international studies, but there is no path for the students who actually train, who actually have some view, because the people who get the best scores in the foreign policy exams are math science graduates, because in the system, in our system, they are the people who are best suited to face exams.
Don't most of them take a Sinhalese exam as well?
Yeah, but this is the thing, I'm not trying to make a discrimination, but I'm going to tell you.
Is that the case, George? No, because you were in the foreign service. Because Harinder is saying this, I just want to ask you: is that the case?
Very few people you can probably count on one hand whose first degree is international relations
or social
science.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
People are coming from very diverse, from the hard sciences, from very different areas.
Is that because the parameters by which they are judged upon are different? They're based on
yes, so at the foreign service exam, they will ask you, do you have any English certificates? And you say, no, because you've learnt in English. And I said, I've studied in English. And they said, no English certificates? You lose marks. Do you have any computer certificates? No, I know how to use a computer. I didn't go for a class. But you get marks for producing, I have an English certificate, I have a computer certificate. But this was some time ago.
Yeah, the point I want to make, George, and about what the Canadian, what they said was not about social science. What they said was, people who are math science, very very hard sciences, they're very very knowledgeable, but they're structured. Social sciences kids are the only people who have learned.
So I can actually contribute to this because my bachelor's is in history and my master's is in politics and governance, right? And during a summer vacation, I applied to the foreign ministry for an internship. I never heard back. And I realized that there were some sort of interns that had been taken from biology and physics and things like that. So I'm privy to this firsthand.
That's the crisis. You know why? Because diplomats are not just, international relations is not about diplomacy. Of course, but diplomats have to be very open-minded. They have to understand. They have to be very critical thinkers. They can. We don't need brilliant mathematicians or scientists in the. We need them. They are
strategists.
Yeah, we need strategy. Who see things. The best strategists strategists are people who can shoot at things that you don't see. If you're the best marksman, you're not a strategist. But if you can guide a hit to a target that you don't see, that's the strategy. Yes, exactly. That's the art of diplomacy that has been perfected over centuries.
So if you want to suggest something materialistic, we might sound so normative and coming here and suggesting some bold things, but if actually the government or the ministry wants to start revisiting things and amending things, this could be a starting point to think about the recruitments and having that collaboration with academics, researchers, and go for a conversation rather than being in their own isolated place and making decisions that would affect all of us.
But the government needs to take that bold decision that both of us that there has to be something on the table in the parliament. There has to be consensus built. It is very hard, but if not, you will always have presidents, leaders have their own foreign policy.
Why Singapore, why Bahamas are more efficient? Because they promote on meritocracy.
Yeah, Singapore has only 30 missions worldwide.
And they promote on meritocracy. I couldn't have survived in these African countries if I couldn't speak good English and write good English. You understand? I couldn't have survived. So merit plays a huge role when you're working outside this country.
So I want to ask.
So I think it is very important that we shift to meritocracy, whether from in the recruitment, in the promotion of our people. Then we will get a better public.
So I have one question for George before I want to pick everyone's brain. I want to give 2 minutes each for the way forward for Sri Lanka. But George, very quickly, tell me, now in 2015, when the general election and the presidential election was held, the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration blamed RAW, India's intelligence service, for their defeat at elections. We saw Vimal Veeravansa's recent book, which clearly points the finger at the United States for the Aragalaya. Do you think these international players are putting their fingers way too much in the territorial integrity, sovereignty, the independence of Sri Lanka?
So, sovereignty, of course, is highly questionable as to whether any country in the world has 100% sovereignty intact. This is highly contested today. Whether those examples you gave, whether they're factual, whether they're true, sometimes you might be giving more credence to the outside player, or you're giving them more importance to the outside player when allegations of that nature are made. You're giving them a higher position than probably what they enjoy in reality. But did they really bring about change? And that is where you feel that it's an insult to Sri Lankans. In 2015, people thought, third term, no way, it's not going to happen. And many people came out and said, no, we don't want a third term. Of course, 6 months down the road, people said, we never voted. That's a different question there. If you look at last year, it was people's power. People had enough. People had enough. If we are going to attribute it and say the Americans were involved in it, the Indians were involved in it, really, so the Sri Lankans do nothing. We just sit back and let the others do whatever they want to do to us. That's not something that I would ascribe to. But at the end of the day, do those countries have influence over people here, over leaders here? Yes, they do.
They do.
They do. Because this is where we don't know where to draw the line. When you have us bending over backwards for others, there's one thing to be hospitable. There's another thing to accommodate everything that you want. I must know where to draw the line because this is my country. This is not your country. When I come to your country, I'll follow your rules. When you come to my country, let's do it the way I do it over here. This is what has to change. This is where we have to bring about that change. And that is something that we are not doing and we haven't done, especially with the Chinese, especially with some of the big players out there. We let them ride roughshod over us. Dr. Vidanage used that term of tier 1 ambassadors or tier 1 countries in terms of Sri Lanka's foreign policy. So there are Security Council members. I'll use the example of France. It's a Security Council permanent member. But France does not enjoy that position in Sri Lanka. You don't find the French ambassador making statements of that nature. You don't even find the Russians coming out. You don't even find them being extremely vociferous. Have we forgotten that there are other countries out there? There are other big players out there. There are other medium-sized players, small players, our neighborhood. We've forgotten them. We're focusing only on these three. And that's where we're losing out. You mentioned non-alignment earlier on. We become non-aligned, or we remember the non-aligned movement and its members when there is a vote in Geneva. Then we are non-aligned. Then we want to talk to African countries. Then we want to talk Latin American countries. I hope we are talking to all of them. Maybe we talk to just some. That's how the results come the way they do. But how do we engage on a continuous basis? We don't have that continuous objective of making sure that our national interests are protected at all times. So all those examples we talked about today, all those countries are doing it because it's in their national interest. It's high time we woke up and realized we've got to act in our national interest.
We shouldn't forget, Dr. George, there were instances where we had to pay money to fertilize a ship that we didn't even take. And as a result of that, they want to blacklist Sri Lankan banks. And Sri Lanka had to go with a begging bowl, seeking their help, not to blacklist us because it looks bad on the Sri Lankan banks at the end of the day. While Twitter, Facebook is banned in those countries, they take full liberty of using that in Sri Lanka to use their freedom of expression to do whatever they want and post whatever they want and to punch above their weight whenever required to make sure that Sri Lanka is put in their place, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's important, we are a small country, we understand that. We sometimes sit in Colombo and think the world revolves around us, it doesn't. When we go up there, we realize we are but one in this large system. The world is not going to cease if we stop exporting. The world is not going to cease if we stop importing their products. They will continue very well. Our people out there are not running the world. We are making an effective contribution, but we're not the most important contributor. We've got to deal with reality first there. But we've also got to realize that we're not going to sit back and say, oh, who am I, what can we do? We are nobodies. That's not the approach either. We've got to promote whatever we have in this country, and this country has so much. Whether we look at it from a tourism point of view, or a trade point of view, or a political point of view, or a historic democratic point of view, we have contributed so much to the world. We have done things. Yeah, we have led.
I recollect, George, when you speak about all this, how the Maitripala Sirisena administration banned asbestos coming into Sri Lanka from Russia. And what did the Russian government do? Find a bug in the Ceylon tea, exactly. and saying, okay, we are holding you hostage if you don't lift this ban. We won't.
We don't understand the dynamics. We don't understand who we are up
very
against.
Unfortunate. Yeah,
we don't understand that.
So I want to give 2 minutes each for each speaker to sum up your thoughts with regard to the way forward for Sri Lanka. So let's start off with Dr. Mendes first.
Yes, I will sum up by quoting a little anecdote. I think I worked in the Bahamas and those countries, in African countries. They took, when it comes to attract the country, the best people to deal with that situation. I remember the Prime Minister of the country saying, I will give you a credit card for you to go to this place in Miami to contact this guy. He plays golf as a person and bring this guy within 3 months with fully paid credit card. And he did it in 1 month, and he became a big investor in that country. So that shows in those countries they use the best attractive young people to bring the topmost player. And then he didn't know this was, the whole thing was planned. And he became an investor in the Four Seasons, in the navies. So you see, they are making use of the best to get the best for the country. We are not doing that. We are never even close to that. You have an expertise, you just die with your expertise in this country. That is what happens. I'm old. I don't need anything more than this. I have had a good time in my life. So I just want to make sure at least the young people get a better run for their education, their future in this country. Unless we do that, we are not going anywhere. We are going backwards and not forwards. That's my message.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mendes. George?
Just to touch on 4 R's. I would like to talk about 4 R's before I close here. The first one being to review. We need to review what has happened, where we are, what we have done, we have done very well. We've gone wrong too, but we need to be able to identify all of that in terms of a review process. We need to start restructuring, whether it's restructuring policy, whether it's restructuring institutions, ministries, missions. We've got to really do a restructuring of the mind as well in the process of changing attitudes. The restructuring is so important. Thirdly, in terms of reaching out, what are we doing to reach out to countries in West Asia, far away, Latin America? We don't have missions in lots of them. We don't do much with them. We've forgotten certain countries which have stood up for us. Countries like Argentina at one time in 1949 brought about a resolution to admit Ceylon into the UN when we were being vetoed. We went and voted against Argentina in the Falklands because we supported the British. And today the Argentinians and the British are together against Sri Lanka. So this is where something's really gone wrong. We've got to reach out to countries, irrespective of the past we've had them, irrespective of whether it's been good or bad, or we've not done anything with them. We've got to reach out. But of course, lastly, we've got to be ready. We've got to be ready for any form of development, whether it be a world economic crisis, whether it be a food shortage, whether it be the looming wheat crisis, whatever it may be, are we ready? How prepared are we to face any kind of eventuality that may come our way? Last year, it was proved that we were not ready. So many times we are seeing that we are not ready to deal with some of the biggest calamities that come our way because we haven't seen them. Right? We don't know that they're coming. And this is where we have not strategized. Last year, we didn't know where we wanted to be on our 75th anniversary. We just wanted to stay afloat. We are now at our 75th junction, and we're hoping that we'll continue to stay afloat and we won't sink. That's not where we should be. As a country, as a people, we don't deserve that. We can't at that point talk about our past. We can't talk about the rich heritage that we have. if we have come to this juncture and we are failing now. We don't deserve that. People in this country don't deserve that. And going forward, we really need a strategy. We need a plan. We need to know where we're going, what we're doing, and how we're going to go about achieving that.
Thank you very much, Dr. George Cook. I now give my attention to Dr. Pavitra Jayawardena.
Yeah, well, I think, having to speak after two diplomats, right? I think there's one thing that have held Sri Lanka back in becoming a better country, better nation, all that, is the willingness of the ruling class to take the country forward for various reasons over the years. I think the failure of the foreign policy, which is very obvious, has also been affected by this, unwillingness of the ruling class of, probably, not being able to understand what we want and all that. So what I would think that what we need right now is aligning our foreign policies for progressive domestic politics, where we place people at the center and probably to adopt a sort of a decolonial approach for our foreign policy as well. And neutrality, middle path, all those words, those are terms, but we should interpret them as how we want it. We have always been, affected by our small state mentality. I mean, we talked about India a lot in today's discussion, and many of the feelings that we have had about India, where India is going to invade us, India is going to take over us. If India really wants to do it, it's a task of a matter of, a couple of minutes, I would say a couple of hours. We are very close, and India is gigantic. It's pretty obvious, right? I think we need to revisit our foreign policy. All these historical mindsets that we have had for realistic reasons. We have been changing. India is changing. There's no one India. You have the central government. You have Chennai, Tamil Nadu, where we have been dealing with multiple communities, federal states, central government, all that. So there's not one India we are talking about. So we need to revisit all that to be able to do it. I think we need to have very potential, people in the in those positions. So if the current ruling class has the willingness to really learn the lesson from the people's uprising and all that, and to sort of amend our foreign policies, I think this will be a good start, because there's nothing to be lost anymore. I mean, we are bankrupted. So I think we really need to have radical changes, and we need to be humble. We need to learn lessons. If this egoistic mindset is overruling everything, that we are the people who know everything, I think we haven't learned the lesson yet.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pavitra. Kusum.
Well, I think it's important to understand, you mentioned we are at rock bottom, maybe, but maybe things could get even worse. You just never know, right? So we've all noticed a Sri Lankan shift or tilt towards China over the last few decades, okay? So how does this fit within the global narrative? The perceptions or the narrative in the media is that the United States is, the power of the US is declining. We are seeing a period of decline, and the new Asian century, China is the next superpower, etc. I want to just give our audience a different point of view, something they can think about at home. China's currently still going through a zero COVID policy. It's had all sorts of effects on its economy. We saw one of the largest property companies in China collapse just 3 or 4 months ago, Evergrande, causing huge protests around the country. People lost their homes, lost their mortgages. China effected the one-child policy during Mao. The one-child policy has led to very grave demographic problems in China.
But not anymore, not anymore.
I don't think so, because currently most countries
it
have...
has been lifted.
The one-child policy has been lifted, but the effects that the one-child policy had are being felt now. So usually most countries, if they want to grow, they need... there's a scholar called Peter Zeihan who does this. You need to have a pyramid of age groups, right, where you have the oldest people at the top, a smaller group, supported by a large group of younger workers. Now, because of the Chinese one-child policy, in China that pyramid looks more like a rectangular. Okay, so you're having a large aging population. The one-child policy also meant people preferred sons over daughters. Okay, so there's also not enough women to have children, so there's also a slowing birth rate. So the Chinese demographic collapse is something that I think is real. There's also we've seen China's rapid urbanization. Hundreds of millions of people have been taken out of poverty. There's another effect that happens when you have growth so rapidly, urbanization. Now, when you grow up in an agricultural community on a farm, you can have as many children as you want because children are free labor at some point in their lives. But when you go into an urban city, children become very expensive, so people stop having children because they become expensive. You have to feed them, you have to send them to school, all these things. So again, that's affecting them. If you look at China's food security, there's a major food security and shortage. China's main protein, 60% is pork. There was about 10 years ago the African swine flu that affected the hogs and the pig population in China. Something close to about 100 million pigs and hogs have been killed since that swine flu period. They're only just coming back to the levels of the 2012 period. The Chinese Navy is under intense pressure. They have only a few naval ships that can travel beyond 1,000 kilometers. So the Chinese economy is essentially a huge sponge. It needs a lot of inputs, including energy. It needs a huge market abroad to buy the goods that they produce. So I think that Sri Lanka really needs to take a look at our future strategies in terms of our development partners. One country that I would, just to finish, I would say, think of Japan. Japan has invested more in infrastructure in the ASEAN trading bloc than China. So, and we have treated the Japanese very poorly in recent times. And I think if we want to look at a future partner, Japan is a good place to start. And so with that, I'll say thank you to Face the Nation and all of you for having me.
Very quickly, sure. I'm not letting you go yet. Go for it. Yeah. One quick question. I saw you moderating the economic blueprint of the SJB a couple of months ago. What do you think would be the strategy of the SJB when it comes to foreign policy?
I think it's the SJB will have to take.
Would it slant towards Japan, as you mentioned?
I would hope so. I just think that why I say Japan specifically is that Japan, for example, is a member of the Quad. Okay, they have a strong relationship with the United States. China and Japan have a history. They have a bit of an antagonism within them. But I think that if we are going to take neutrality, put that to a side and have a strategy, Japan is a country that has cheap money. They're investing around the world. They have very low interest rates. And we have a good relationship with Japan up to, I suppose, the last 5 years. So I think it's something that we should take more advantage of, because why do we can't, let's take a look at Taiwan. Can we approach Taiwan as Sri Lanka? No, we can't, because of our Chinese relationships, right? So in that case, let's look at a country that we might have more access to. And I think Japan is one of them.
So thank you very much, Kusum. But last but not at all the least, Dr. Harinder.
I'll just tie up from where I started. I talked about policies, where we want to go, and the major hurdle being, I think, I agree, I mean, all of us are well intended, but if we don't have that consensus built, if we don't have a set of policies that are tangible and that all of us can, work on, then this conversation in next 10 years ahead will be the same. So I think Sri Lanka should, at least when we are at the brink, as even Pavitra said, we have nothing to lose, then at least that moment we have to have a strategic revelation that we need to get these things done. So I think still the parliament is, legislature is the place, so there has to be that consensus built, and foreign policy, at least a set of pillars, fundamentals in place with a certain set of values. Few values are always there. That's why I said democracy, governance, we can debate, but that's a value we have to set in. And because we are the oldest democracy in Asia and next to the largest democracy in the world, so it gives us a certain set of values that we are doing. Then of course our economic policies, our strategies of national security and defense, that has to come into place. Then I think, I know it's painful, but we have to calibrate India foreign policy, Sri Lanka's foreign policy towards India, how we are going to understand and work with India. Because of India's as George said, is right. They work on their interests, but their interests, in their interests, they have a particular view on Sri Lanka. And how are we going to manage that? India, and because the Indian Ocean, the problem is, even in the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US, there is a criticism coming from the US itself saying it's more Pacific, no Indo, because the Biden's latest iteration says we accept Indian leadership, and that is true. That is true for Japan. That is true for France. You know, France still has a small, colonial. It's a colonial power. 95% of its colonial interests are in the Indian Ocean. So it's going to work. It's going to engage us, but it's going to engage us through India. Japan has serious interest in Indian Ocean, but they are the major military and civil infrastructure provider for India. From Andaman Nicobar Islands to the listening stations to the radar station, there's a lot of Japanese investment. So these countries have seen how India has changed. So this is what we call geographic fatalism. We are fatalistic to be next to India. So we have, how much we like or hate, that policy has to be in place. If we don't have a right India policy, so first thing is consensus building on a foreign policy that people can work on, legislatures can work on, we can debate on, but primary arm of that has to be the values, how we look at the world, the region, India, then of course working with the new dimension. So I don't want to go deep. I think I have a few minutes, so I wrap it up there. But I think build consensus, have a set of foreign policy fundamentals, then we can have a debate beyond the sons and daughters. I mean, I hear all of you. It's critical. It's crucial, right? But that debate has to go beyond that. If not, 10 years later, we still will be debating. Some of your friends or daughters are about being in foreign missions. So I don't think we should leave that legacy behind. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harinder. So thank you very much, Dr. Dayanda Laksari Mendes, former Executive Director of the Lakshman Kadirgam Institute, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation.
Thank you.
Dr. George Cook, diplomatic historian and strategist. Dr. Pavitra Jayawardena, Senior Lecturer, University of Colombo. Kusum Vijayatilaka, Foreign Policy Analyst, as well as Dr. Harinder Vidanage, Head of Department, Strategic Studies at the Kotalaval Defence University. Thank you very much, Jayama, for joining us this evening, as well as Shania. I'm so glad, Shania, you didn't get that posting at the Foreign Ministry, because we wouldn't have had you here today. So you've used your time and energy for something better, for sure. So I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. Greatness is not guarding yourself from the people. It's being accepted by the people. Take care. Good night.